Compression. In the simplest possible terms, a compressor will turn down or attenuate any signal with an amplitude which rises over a certain amount, known as a threshold. This means that more intense areas of the signal are usually reduced to roughly match the rest of the waveform. This results in the average amplitude of the signal being reduced. As a result, an amount of gain, usually approximately equal to the amount attenuated, is applied to return the signal to a useful level. Loudness is a perceptual attribute of sound related to the relative intensity between the thresholds of human hearing and the intensity of a given sound, in addition to factors relating to the spectral content, sound duration, and the background noise level. By reducing the most intense part of a signal, we are reducing the dynamic range, the difference between the more or less intense parts of a signal. Due to this, the signal's amplitude is more consistently at a higher intensity, and this makes the resulting sound feel louder, even though the compressed signal might never reach the same peak amplitude as the original sound. When set up correctly, a compressor can be used to keep the amplitude of a signal relatively consistent, meaning that the level of a track won't constantly jump around. This allows us to level balance instruments more effectively within the mix and be sure that they're not going to be too high in the mix at some points or inaudible at others. A compressor operates on a signal in the following way. First, the compressor looks for amplitudes over a certain value. This is the threshold value. Once an amplitude over the threshold value has been reached, the compressor begins to engage. This means that the compressor will start to attenuate the signal. The amount of time taken for the compressor to fully engage is called the attack. You can imagine this as a ramp, introducing more attenuation over time. A longer attack means that the first part of the signal to cross the threshold won't be attenuated. A short attack means that it will be. When the amplitude level dips back below the threshold, the compressor will start to disengage. This means that it will stop attenuating the signal. The time taken for the compressor to disengage is called release. This will reduce the attenuation over a set amount of time. A long release value might mean that the compressor is constantly reducing amplitude to some extent, whilst a short release might mean that the compressor stops compressing whilst the amplitude is still quite high. This can cause the compressor to switch on and off too often, causing a noticeable pumping effect. So one question you might have here is, by how much does a compressor attenuate a signal which is over the threshold? The signal attenuation amount is based on the amount of signal which goes above the threshold. We calculate this as a ratio, and as such the control for this on a compressor is also called ratio. You will find a wide range of ratios available depending on the type and manufacturer of the compressor you're using. However, because they deal with the amplitude over the threshold, they are expressed in decibels. The number on the left of the ratio represents the amount of input amplitude needed to increase the signal by the amount shown on the right, which is usually 1 decibel. By using this ratio, we can work out how much we are compressing our signal by. A ratio of 1:1 is the lowest compression ratio, and it represents no attenuation. For every 1 decibel increase in the input signal, the output signal increases by 1 decibel as well. A ratio of 2:1 indicates that a signal exceeding the threshold by 2 decibels will be attenuated down to 1 decibel above the threshold, or that a signal exceeding the threshold by 8 decibels will be attenuated down to 4 decibels above it. A ratio of 4 to 1 indicates that a signal exceeding the threshold by 4 decibels will be attenuated down to 1 decibel above the threshold, or that a signal exceeding the threshold by 12 decibels will be attenuated down to 3 decibels above it, etc., etc. In short, the higher the number on the left, the more amplitude over the threshold is needed to create a 1 decibel change in the resultant signal. You can quite quickly get to a point where compression ratios effectively mean that your signals never go above the threshold. So choosing the correct ratio for the task at hand is important. A ratio of around 3 to 1 can be considered moderate compression. I usually use this for bus compression, acoustic instruments, and vocals. I consider 5 to 1 to be medium compression. I usually start my drums around this level and tweak a little bit if I need to. 8 to 1 starts getting into strong compression. I would typically compress more powerful bass guitars around this ratio. And 20 to 1 through to infinity to 1 would be considered limiting by most people and can be used to ensure that a signal does not exceed the amplitude of the threshold. This diagram shows compression ratios as they relate to the input and output signals and illustrate how setting your compression ratio will affect the overall signal. Once a compressor is attenuating the signal, with the threshold, attack, release, and ratio set, we can use the gain control to increase the output level of the compressor. As I mentioned before, I usually increase this to be around the same or just a little less than the average amount that we're attenuating. If my gain reduction meter is hitting about -6, I might set my gain control to be about 5 or 6. One final control which can be found on some compressors is the knee control. This determines how the compressor engages or disengages. The compressor can be said to have either a soft knee or a hard knee, as shown in the diagram on screen. A hard knee will mean that the compressor will engage or disengage when the signal amplitude crosses the threshold. A soft knee will allow the application of attenuation to be more gradual as the amplitude increases. This creates a smoother, less noticeable compression. Typically, compressors with hard knees are good for instruments such as drums, guitars, or pianos, whilst vocals and wind instruments sound more natural with a soft knee. On some compressors, the knee control is a simple switch between hard and soft. Some compressors won't have a knee control at all. Let's go back to our kick drum from earlier and set up a compressor. This first compressor will overcompress the drum with too high a ratio and a long release. This means that the drum will lose all of its dynamics, and we will hear more of the noise floor. This second compressor setup will compress the drum a bit more reasonably. However, I'm going to give it a short attack, which is going to kill the transient of the drum. Notice how much more powerful the drum sounds when I bypass the plugin. This final compressor is set up a lot better and provides a more consistent amplitude between each note without compromising the punch of the transient. This is because a slightly longer attack time is allowing the transient through before compressing the signal. You should also notice some tonal changes to the spectral content. Have a think about why this might have happened. Let's now look at the waveforms of these three processed signals side by side with the original. Note that I've altered the gain so that the waveforms appear similar in height. This is so that you can view the differences more easily. Notice how square the overcompressed signal is, and how the final compressor reduces the dynamic range so that the drum hits are all more similar in level. We've seen how gating and compression are implemented, but also crucially the effect they have on the amplitude envelope of a signal. We can shape the transient or the release of a signal with these tools, and considering the implications of this is critical to successfully implementing these tools on your mixes. Consider the implications of using gating and compression on various instruments such as drums, bass guitar, piano, and vocals. Have a think about the amplitude envelopes for these instruments, and how certain attack and release values in compression and gating could positively or negatively affect them.